Hello, and welcome to the Matthew 25 podcast, the podcast at First Presbyterian Church in Westchester, Pennsylvania, where we discuss the words of Jesus in, you guessed it, Matthew 25. Today's podcast features First Pres member Kathleen Skomorucha. Kathleen teaches Sunday school here at First Pres, serves on our session, and has participated in the Matthew 25 task force. Kathleen sits down with Sara Pantazes as they discuss the relational nature of service, her experiences with poverty in India, parenting and justice, and reflections on the Welcome Homeless book by Alan Graham. Before we get to that conversation, Sara will be summarizing this week's reading, chapters 7 and 8 from Welcome Homeless. If you wish to skip ahead to the featured conversation, you can skip ahead now to approximately 9.5 minutes. Thank you for listening to the Matthew 25 podcast.
Welcome again to the Matthew 25 podcast. This is Sara Pantazes, Director of Christian Education, with a summary of chapters 7 and 8 of Welcome Homeless. Chapter 7 is titled, Laura Tyre Was an Engineer. Laura was born in the Four Corners region of New Mexico on a Navajo reservation. Graham writes, quote, her father was an Englishman, her mother was Navajo, and just like her heritage crossed boundaries, so did everything else about her. Laura was born an incredibly intelligent, kind, and creative boy. As she grew, she realized that the reservation would never provide the opportunities she wanted or perhaps needed, so she left at age 12 and took a bus to Austin. Her plan was to master technology and then return to help her tribe. She worked to earn her GED, bachelor's degree, and a master's degree in electrical engineering, all while living on the streets. And at some point, she connected with a doctor who was willing to do her gender reassignment surgery pro bono. Through Laura's story, Graham explores the theme of loneliness in this chapter. It's something that Laura experienced acutely. It is the one thing that homeless people will say is the most difficult part of being homeless, and it's something that all humans have in common. Graham takes a pretty deep theological dive into this theme of loneliness. He suggests that God is just as lonely for us as we are for God. From God's perspective, God created us and loves us with an amazing love. That's what the whole biblical story is about. But we don't return that love very well. And from the human perspective, we know that we aren't complete without God, and we spend our lives looking to relieve that loneliness and reconnect with God. But God's relationship with loneliness doesn't end there. Graham asserts that, quote, when God became incarnate, so did loneliness. Incarnation refers to how Jesus was fully human while on earth. So when Jesus became fully human, he experienced, among many things, human loneliness. And so, therefore, did God. This is the epitome of the word compassion, which means to suffer with. Jesus coming to earth was partly about God wanting to suffer with, God's willingness to experience human loneliness. The Merriam-Webster definition of compassion is sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. This is a quality that Graham attributes to Laura, who didn't let her own suffering and loneliness keep her from showing compassion to others. She couldn't give money to those that she saw around her in need, but instead gave her gifts and time and energy. Graham says that she helped distribute clothing to women, tutored in math and science, worked at a food pantry, and was all around an extraordinary, gentle, and caring woman. All of that said, Laura's story ends pretty tragically. One day she was hit by a bus and ended up in the hospital. And although she had a Movil Loaves and Fishes friend who grew concerned when she hadn't heard from Laura and tracked her down in the hospital, this friend was not allowed to visit Laura. Laura developed a staph infection from her injuries and died, alone. Graham ends the chapter with a reflection on the alternative that God has given us to human loneliness, and that is relationships. Connecting that to homelessness, he writes this: I think it's time now that you and I change the way people view how we are to serve people. That it's not with an attitude that says, here's your need, here's your meal unit, here's your cot, here's your bread and juice. but rather it starts with you and I participating, not with our checkbooks, but with our lives, allowing our threads to be so intertwined that their suffering is our suffering. It's with our relationships and our willingness to befriend another human being. It's with love. Remember that communion without sacrificial love is just bread and wine. Don't just give the homeless a handout. Give them your hand. And that commentary on the importance of relationships is a perfect segue to chapter 8, which features not just one homeless person, but two, a couple. The title of chapter 8 is The Love Story of Brooke and Robin. Graham spends a lot of space in this chapter telling their story, and it's a very colorful story because they are colorful characters. Brooke and Robin met in 2004. Brooke was a stereotypical bad boy. He was charismatic, good-looking, smart, a drug dealer, and only loved three things: robbing places, drugs, and Robin. Robin was a seemingly perfect match for Brooke. She rode bikes like him, had a big mouth that could keep up with his and get her in trouble. She stood up for herself and was all around a strong woman. And together, they were a volatile couple, getting into spats frequently, but also strongly devoted to one another. They moved in and out of different living situations, in and out of jail, of rehab, and eventually their life journey moved them out of Houston, where they met, and they landed in Austin. Around this time, Graham tells us he acquired a small plot of land that he was envisioning turning into a community for the homeless to live in and build relationships. And as this vision became a reality, Brooke and Robin landed there, and they really created a beautiful home. Graham goes into detail about how the 16 by 14-foot tent they lived in was furnished, decorated, the improvised shower they created so they could bathe every day, the fire that Brooke always had burning, and the kitchen sink that he propped between two trees and rigged up with PVC pipes to drain to the creek. Brooke and Robin were clean and organized and committed to their home. Not too long after they settled in Austin, Robin got pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl they named Avery. And 1 week later, Brooke and Robin got into a fight. Brooke was arrested, Child Protective Services was called, and Avery ended up going home with Graham and his wife Tricia because Robin didn't want her daughter going into foster care. And in case you're wondering, Graham was 55 years old at this time and had already raised his own 4 children. And he freely admits that he was not happy with the idea of committing to caring for a newborn. But he also said that by day 3, he was hooked. He wrote, "It reminded me that no human life could ever be an inconvenience. Not little Avery, whom I expected to raise to adulthood, and not troublemakers Brooke and Robin." Fortunately, the result of this fight wasn't extended jail time. Brooke and Robin both entered rehab. They were allowed to see Avery every day, and they worked hard to prove their parenting skills. And 5 months later, a judge allowed the family to be reunited. Graham tells us that 6 years later, as of the writing of the book, they were all still together, living in a 3-bedroom home. And he wrote, quote, "If you ask them what's kept them together for 9 years, their first answer will be something about how it's illegal in America to kill your spouse. But they'd follow up with the answer, patience, kindness, tolerance, love." Graham credits Avery's existence with saving her parents. The purpose and love they felt for their daughter set them up for success. So it's appropriate that the lesson Graham teaches in this chapter is focused on family. He wrote, quote, "The single greatest cause of homelessness is a catastrophic loss of family." He asserts that the foundation each person builds their life on is family. Those are the relationships we know first. And when that foundation is unstable, it inevitably affects that person's life. So what might be the solution? Graham asserts that DNA isn't what defines family. He says that we can choose to be family to one another. He describes this as us realizing our familial relationships, that we are all brothers and sisters needing to be reunited, needing to be there for our estranged family. Being family doesn't mean we can solve each other's problems, but maybe we can help. Maybe we can be in the mess and commit to being in the mess and believing in each other.
And now for our featured conversation with Kathleen Skomorucha.
I am here today with First Press member Kathleen Skomorucha. Kathleen, you frequently open your emails to me and others here at the church with "Hello, friends," which is such a lovely way to open an email and begin to read, and it perfectly exemplifies the kind, caring, and warm person that you are. So it's a joy to have you here on the podcast with us, and thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So we asked you to join us for this conversation, both because you have had a somewhat unique experience with poverty that we wanted to explore with you, but also because you felt a strong calling to participate in the Matthew 25 initiative when we started talking about it last year. And we wanted to hear your thoughts on how it's doing, how you're doing, where we're going. So we'll get into all of that in a minute. But to start with, we're going to back up and I'll invite you to introduce yourself and tell us about yourself and your family and how long you've been here at the church and some of what you're involved in here.
Sure. I'm happy to be here. And I will say that I have listened to every podcast episode since this launched, and I am in amazing company. It's remarkable to listen to people's stories. So let's see. Introducing myself. So my husband, Frank, and I joined the church probably, I think I was hugely pregnant with Grace at the time. So that would make it about 7 years ago. And in that time, I have, accepted invitations to be involved in different ways. And the first of which was to teach Sunday school to kindergarten and first graders, which I am still doing. I am a part of a wonderful group of people who teach our little ones. And from there, someone asked me to become a part of our Christian education committee. And so I came on as an elder, and I am rolling off as the chair, but I am still a member of session for the next year until I serve out my term. And in that time was when Matthew 25 was really birthed as an idea for this congregation and moving forward. From an all-encompassing mission perspective. And it has been an absolute honor and pleasure to have been a part of that process.
Yeah.
And to continue to be a part of it.
Yeah. Okay. Why, as best you can kind of tell, what was it about the Matthew 25 task force that kind of grabbed your heart and your attention? Why was that an important thing for you to be involved in when it came about?
So I've struggled with the action piece of love for a long time. And how do we show love to our brothers and sisters in ways that are relevant to them and tangible? My professional life is spent working with children with physical disability. And through the relationships that I've developed with those children, I realize how much I have gained from working with them and how important developing relationship over time where they explore their gifts with me and I explore my gifts with them. And it's a give and take and I've had an honor of having that be my profession for the past 18 years. And in what way can we as a faith community develop relationship with our neighbors who show that they have a need that maybe we can fill, but maybe we can also just be in relationship and walk beside them. And maybe we have nothing more to give them than just an empathetic ear and someone to walk beside them when they're in pain. Because we all need it. Every one of us needs someone to walk beside us when we're in pain. And some people have the blessing of having a supportive family or a supportive friend structure or a supportive spouse to be able to do that. And some people just don't. And how can we walk beside people who need people to walk beside them when they don't have anyone else?
Yeah.
And I feel a strong calling to that. So when Matthew 25 started, we weren't sure in which direction it was going to move. And I love the whole idea of housing insecurity. The church has been really involved in so much of this stuff for so many years, decades and decades before we even called it Matthew 25. People have been doing this beautiful work for forever. And I loved the whole idea of encompassing it in the Matthew 25 initiative and really rooting it in scripture. And there was so much of it that spoke to me, clearly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Now, professionally, you have had some experiences in the last few years where you witnessed poverty firsthand in a really powerful way. So we were hoping that you could tell us about that and what your reaction to it was and how your faith responded to that experience as well.
Yes. So part of my work at Nemours led me to going to India. So I work with children with cerebral palsy and other neuromotor disorders, and I have specialty training in that. And I have a professional group that I work very closely with. They teach all over the world and all that fun stuff. I'm not quite there yet. But one was invited to be a mentor to staff, to Indian trained staff in Delhi. And asked me if I would be willing to go as well. So this started about 4 years ago. I went 3 years ago, my first time, and went smack dab in the middle of Delhi, India. And so it was raw in every way. The poverty is very apparent because of the magnitude of it. From the moment that you step off the plane, there are things that I had never seen. And India did a very good job of stripping away lots of layers of me that I didn't even really realize existed, and left me in a very vulnerable place. And in that vulnerable place, the light of God is much better able to shine. And I am forever indebted for that experience. And the trips since have been equally as unsettling is probably the best word. That type of poverty I had never seen.
Okay.
And the faces of the children are still images that I wrestle with, probably on a daily basis.
Okay. So when you talk about it being poverty that you'd never seen, can you like flesh that out a little bit? Like just
Sure.
What are some of the memories you have of what you saw that was so troubling?
So I'm not a stranger to travel, I will say that. I'm not a stranger to other cultures. I love it all. I love that experience. I had never seen the number of people who weren't wearing shoes, or were begging for something, or were young children who had children on their hips as they were asking for money. Babies who had these beautiful eyes and it looked like they hadn't eaten in days. Ragged clothing and clearly nowhere to be, or cardboard boxes that were being used truly as shelter, as the only shelter that was available. And I had seen that in traveling other places in this country as well, but the children, and I think that's always been my, children have always been something, a group of people who have always pulled at me. And when you see people who are already vulnerable and now are even more vulnerable, it just, it's nothing you can put to words.
Yeah. So are those children that you were working with in the work you were doing over there? Or is it just what you saw as you were moving through the streets?
Both. So the clinic that we go to support when I go over, the woman who runs the clinic was born and raised in America. Her parents, she's a first-generation American. Her parents grew up in India. She's back, married for love. She's back there to run the clinic. And the medical director was trained in America as well. So they have an American sensibility about wanting care for all and interdisciplinary care, meaning everybody talks to each other about the best approaches to care for kids who are very medically complex. And that's really unique. That's something that's pretty unique in India. And our first year, especially when we came over, there were people who wanted us to see children who were in different castes. And there were other paying clientele at the facility that would not come back if those kids were allowed to be treated at the clinic, period.
Wow.
By our third year going, we were able to treat some of those children, not at the same time, but in the same space.
Okay.
And so there had been some traction on that because the team, we all felt very driven to make that different. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
There's much more to be said about it,
Right.
but it's
Yeah. Okay. So that's obviously a very, very heavy experience, to put it. That's an inadequate word. But I also wonder, and you may have answered this a little bit already, but what was there that was joyful about that trip, or that sparked not just sadness, but some happiness and glimpses of God in the midst of all of that pain?
So it was remarkable. Because I think when I found myself kind of stripped away from everything familiar, you're just kind of left open. And in comes this beautiful light. Generally for me, in my experience, it was the light of the people that I was with. So it was the parents or the children I was working with, or even people who are not being used or who are not used to being looked directly in their eyes. There are plenty of people in the world who are not used to being seen. And if you look at them and say hello, it's the expression, first they're taken back, generally. And then it's amazing how their whole demeanor changes. And I think that was really the beauty of and it began, and I couldn't put it to words my first year, probably not even my second, maybe my third I could. By my third I could. I'm still wrestling with so much of this that I can't put to words. But that, I think, sparked in me the whole idea that really all anybody wants is to be seen and heard, and to know that somebody actually will take the time to do that. And so in casual encounters, but also in casual encounters, I experienced that. But in some of the deeper relationships that developed over time, I had some really amazing experiences with the people who thanked us for coming and actually hearing what they had to say and seeing the things that they'd been telling people all along, but nobody ever affirmed, and really helping them feel empowered to care for their children in ways that they felt like they hadn't been supported to do before.
Yeah.
So that was different than what I experienced.
Okay. Yeah, I so appreciate you saying that, because one of the points that Graham makes in one of the chapters we're reading this week is he says that homeless people will tell you the hardest part of being homeless is the loneliness, and that people don't look you in the eye, and you die on the streets and nobody knows and nobody cares. And he explores that theme of loneliness like really deeply in the chapter. And so what I hear you saying is loneliness is not just a homeless problem. It's not just a homeless in America problem. It's a global thing. It's really something that any human can experience. And our ability to alleviate loneliness in just one person is powerful.
And loneliness exists along all, it's universal. And it doesn't matter how much material wealth you have, and none of that matters, though. Right. I do believe that people who are marginalized experience that more profoundly in many, many ways for lots of different reasons, all of which I can't begin to articulate or even understand. I'm trying, I'm learning.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most amazing things to me in kind of diving into some of this work in a culture that I'm very unfamiliar with and still learning about is the profound effect of the transformative effect of suffering and love. It's like how they both have a way of stripping everything down to its essence and transforming the spirit. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely amazing to watch, it's an honor to be a part of some of that and to watch some of that happen.
Yeah.
To alleviate some suffering and dive in and do your best to try to alleviate it if you can, or just be right next to them as they're doing something that you have no ability to alleviate. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I listened to the podcast with the gals, the women who do the listening work, and I was flabbergasted. I just was so moved. I was crying in my car, mm-hmm. Because there's oftentimes nothing that you can do other than to sit beside someone mm-hmm. as they're in pain.
Mm-hmm. And it was also beautiful for them in some senses it might seem like all you do is listen, really? Like that's all that your group is about? But that is all that they're about, and that is enough.
It's more than enough.
Right.
It's more than what we give so many people.
Yeah.
And sometimes all people need from you is to walk beside them,
mm-hmm.
to know that they've been seen, to know that they've been heard, and to know that on some level, on some small level, that they understand that maybe you've walked through a pain of your own that maybe looks nothing like theirs, but you've walked through that pain and you know what it feels like, mm-hmm. and you know how valuable it was for you at that point in time to have someone to walk with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that's it. Maybe mm-hmm. that's all you understand about their circumstance, but you're there. Mm-hmm. One of my dearest childhood friends is of the Jewish faith, and I've always marveled at that the Jewish communities generally, and they show up. Mm-hmm. Like they show up with food when people are in pain, and they just show up and they just sit. Mm-hmm. And I always thought as a kid, now isn't that really? They're just sitting. Everybody's just sitting, right? But but I hadn't been through anything at that point, and I didn't understand the profound effect that has on people's selves, their soul. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So kind of one more question in this vein. You and I are both parents of young kids in this congregation, and the CE committee has been very supportive of me starting this Young Justice Builders Club to help weave our kids into this Matthew 25 conversation. And that is hard. Like part of why I wanted to do that is because as parents, we have an inclination to shield our children from the hard, painful things of this world. But there's also an argument to be made that we shouldn't shield them, that we should let them know what's going on and give them a framework in which to understand it. So coming back from India, especially the first couple of times being so difficult and raw and painful for you, how have you talked about that with your kids and drawn them into that experience without, scaring them, I guess?
I'd love to hear Frank's perspective on this. He's my better half in many, many ways. And he's walked with me through a lot of this. And these are conversations that he and I have had. So he didn't walk with me through the journey in India, but we've known each other a very long time, and he knows how it impacted me. I don't know that I have an awesome answer to this question because I'm still figuring it out myself. But I think the thing that they know it's hard. They know it's hard on me to go because the number of kids that need help, that need their mother's help, is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And they know that that's hard for me. Because you can't help enough of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've seen it several times now and had to come home each time. Yeah, I can imagine that's really hard.
What they also know is that it's drawn me closer to God. Mm-hmm. So.
And that's going to reverberate in their lives for their whole lives. Like the faith of parents is so instrumental in kids.
I think.
And they'll remember this.
And I think one of the things that might be most valuable is that they understand that faith is ever evolving and that moms and dads don't have it all figured out.
Yeah.
And that there are experiences in adult life that force you to challenge the things that maybe you never really thought about before, and that drive you deeper into conversation with God, especially when there are things that make absolutely no sense at all by our perspective. And so one of the things that Ben and I, actually, our 9-year-old and I have talked about a little bit is he asked, in pictures, he saw that there were children and dogs sleeping together. And he said, well, it's like here, like, dogs sleep with kids here. And that was such an interesting observation to me, because he didn't see what I saw. And that was actually pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's very innocent. Yeah.
And so maybe sometimes we overthink the things that we overthink sometimes how it's going to influence them, and they'll take it in very, very different ways. So to answer your question, the stories come out a little at a time, and generally I let them direct some of it. They know the work that I do there because they know it's very similar to the work that I do here. But the other stuff, it kind of comes out when we talk about pictures, or when I taste a food and I was like, oh my gosh, it was so hot this time, I can't remember, and tell them a story about that. Yeah. And it generally is lighthearted. Leah is chomping at the bit to go. She can't wait to go to India and see it. And the time will come.
Would you be able to take her?
Yeah, Frank and I have talked about all of us going, because he would really like to go as well. I worry a little bit. The time I normally spend in India is in North India, and the spice palette in North India is pretty heavy duty. And I kind of like spice, but it's like real deal spice. And so I worry my belly is always a little off when I'm there, because it's just everything's so spicy all the time. And so we have a sensitivity to that when it comes to all of us going, because, Gracie's still little. Like she has a 6-year-old belly. We have like old bellies, they've been through some of that. So, I don't know. We'll see. I would, because I think they would see the world differently. And I wish I'd had, you can't say that. It came when it should have for me, but wouldn't it have been amazing for me to have had some of those experiences younger?
Yeah.
Because how would it have shaped me?
Yeah. Well, I've got to say, I think it's amazing that you're holding in tension this very amazing desire to bring your whole family and have that shape your kids at a young age, but also the very practical consideration of why it might not be a good idea. I totally relate to that. And I think a lot of parents do, in that we might want to put our kids in situations to help them learn, but there's also practical concerns, and there's just a tension there that we all have to feel out as we go along. And as parents, it is okay to be protective sometimes. We don't have to throw all of us in the deep end to still start having these conversations with our kids and experiences when appropriate.
Yeah. And, as a parent, there's always that delicate balance. You don't, some of the people, and I have said this over and over again when talking about my experiences in India, I have met some of the most amazing human beings that I have ever encountered in India. The work that is done there is, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And all this sounds really cliched, because everybody who comes back from India tells you how amazing everybody is in India. That's not true. Not everybody in India is amazing. Just like not everybody in the United States is amazing. But some of the work that people do in the context in which they do it is almost feels superhuman. Yeah. And so that they're guided by a light that is divine. Because there's no other way to do it.
Right. That's amazing. That's a really cool perspective on the world. Okay, so we're going to zoom back home.
Yep, totally.
And my next question was how your experiences in India, which is obviously a very different context, how those have shaped how you think about serving and being in relationship with those who are in need here in Westchester. And maybe it's not just apples to oranges, but apples to sushi, and there's no comparing the two.
No, I believe that there is such I believe that there are consistent themes. I believe that there is. I believe, and I said it earlier, that people need to be heard and loved, and that doesn't matter where in the world you are. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that this initiative is designed with the intention of us forming relationships so that we are in positions to see and hear people and provide if they have a need that we can satisfy, or maybe what we do is just walk with them. Mm-hmm. I have a real sensitivity to single parents, whether it be mother or father with dependents. Mm-hmm. That's what I saw a lot in India, and what I absolutely see here. Mm-hmm. And so I think both my work in India, my work here, my job as a mom, my love of my children lends me to really dive into how can we support young mothers, young fathers, mothers and fathers with dependents when they're trying to traverse it with very limited resources. Mm-hmm. And I believe we have I think that we can all add much of our own experience to guide us into those relationships. Mm-hmm. And I'm so excited by all of it. I don't know what all of it means yet, though.
Right. Yeah, we're not there quite yet.
No, we're not. But there are so many things that have been stirring in my heart, and so many interesting things that have happened externally. Chester County, I'm going to get the verbiage incorrect, but just opening itself as a safe place for refugees really speaks to me as someone who has traveled and has experience with people who come from other areas of the world here for a variety of different freedoms that they may not have at home. And how can we support them as they come? How can we support those that are here who need some form of assistance? Yeah. I don't know what it's all going to look like yet.
There's probably lots of options available to us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get there. Okay. So we are about 2/3 of the way through the Welcome Homeless book now. Mm-hmm. January has just flown by. And I know that you have read the whole book already because you were part of the task force that helped to choose that for the all-church read. So I was just wondering what one or two of your biggest takeaways from the book have been. What has stuck with you?
I thought this book was fantastic. So I'll just put that right out there. Of course, everyone who's reading it probably feels the same way. I think it's always really refreshing to be reminded that people's circumstances do not define who they are. Mm-hmm. And I think lots of us like to, it's an easy thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. To define someone by their circumstances. But I think it's a beautiful reminder that there's so much that exists beneath the superficial for every person. Mm-hmm. So defining someone by whether they have a roof over their head or not is something that we need to be careful of. And it doesn't even scratch the surface of who that person is. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the overarching message of this book, is you dive in because they are people, just like you are a person, and they have needs just as you do. Their needs are different than yours, and you need to have a sensitivity to that. But that's no reason not to dive in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, Elizabeth Guman was talking about that a little bit in the podcast last week, that the way we use our language, it's not that they're homeless people, but people who are experiencing homelessness, which takes longer to say and is more of a mouthful, but there's a really important distinction in that.
And I have had the honor of being a part of organizations that have emphasized that for a long time. Mm-hmm. So in my graduate school work, we were always told to describe someone not by their condition, but by who they are, and they had a condition. And so that has kind of become second nature to me, but it's interesting to read this book and be reminded of it again in a different context. And I think when you treat someone with that, and when you make a point of talking about them as a human and then their circumstances second, I hope you are communicating with them in a way that helps to restore their dignity, at least in some small part.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. One thing that keeps coming up for me over and over again as I'm in this book is the idea of relationships, which we've talked about a little bit today. And Graham seems to feel really strongly that helping the homeless needs to be about more than giving our money towards the problem. He wants us to be in relationship with people and to affirm that humanness and dignity in them. And even though that can be really, really messy, and I think that messy can be off-putting to some people who would say, no, I just can't handle that. I'm going to stay over here where I'm more safe and comfortable in my bubble. And I can certainly relate to that feeling. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that idea are, and maybe what that means for the people in our church. And I say that knowing that's a huge question and you're only one person in our church, but whatever thoughts you have.
So I've spent a while thinking about that question. Or not the question, but just that concept. And this morning I was doing my devotional and I was reading a book by Mark Nepo, and this just jumped out at me. This is a quote from a book called The Book of Awakening. And it says, "When we bear our inwardness fully, exposing our strengths and frailties alike, we discover a kinship in all living things, and from this kinship, a kindness moves through us and between us." And something about that spoke to me, because I think that I don't want to minimize the importance of charitable giving, because I believe lots of organizations are sustained by people who believe in an initiative and want to support it monetarily.
Absolutely.
But I believe that there's another level of involvement as well. I think when you allow yourself to be involved, you're allowing yourself to be vulnerable to the circumstances, good, bad, or ugly. You're going to learn something from all of it. And I think that it's only through jumping in and being a part of kind of the dance of that a relationship with someone that the beauty, the joy pops out, and so does some of the pain, and so does some of but that's lots of relationships if you really think about them. And that's where you get to the essence of living out your faith. It's in the beauty, but it's also in the ugly, and it's in the joy, the celebrations, but it's also in kind of the feeling downhearted when something happens that's really not what you expected. And I think, but that's where the transformation happens, right? That's where you become pretty vulnerable to the circumstances, and that's when God's light shines in through all of the vulnerable cracks. I think that's the essence. And that's why Jesus compels us to move into those spaces, because that's when the real transformation happens. Hopefully, both for the person that you're working with or walking beside, but certainly for you. And that's why I believe so strongly in what we're doing here. It's the love, above all love, but it's the action piece of that now, in whatever way it's going to take shape.
Well said. I don't have anything else to say to that other than well said.
It's not a perfect answer. It's not a black and white answer. And I think the older I get, the less I believe in black and white answers. Right.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe they exist.
Yeah. So especially not in something this hard.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any last thoughts you wanted to share?
I I think we probably covered most
covered
of
a
it.
lot. We covered a lot of ground. Well, I just want to say thank you for coming in and being vulnerable and sharing your heart with us. I suspect a lot of people listening have had their own experiences seeing brokenness in the world and having their heart broken and having to work through that in their circumstances and still feeling discontent that brokenness is there and we want to fix it, and it's so hard to do. But I think that this church is full of people who are committed to still searching for that not black and white answer. Yes. And doing what we can. And I just appreciate you sharing that story and
thank you.
With us.
My only parting thought is that I was listening to a podcast, as many people who love and know me well know that I love podcasts and I love to read. And I was listening to a podcast and someone was talking about the work of faith. And he was saying, it's a long story and you're only a small part of it. And it's not all going to be fixed when you jump in, and it's not all going to be fixed when you finish your work. Mm-hmm. But understand that it's a long trajectory, and it's where Christ moves through us, and it's how Christ moves through us.
Yeah.
And God's got it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.